Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2023, the Summer of Trek. This is a BookTube event created by Vin at Revenant Reads, where he and a group of other BookTubers, including myself, are reading Star Trek fiction all summer long. June, July, and August. No plan other than that. Any Star Trek at any time. And I don't need much encouraging to do that. I've been reading Star Trek. Well, I was going to say I've been reading Star Trek since the beginning, but if we count the beginning as James Blish's numbered adaptations of the television screenplays, then I've been reading Star Trek fiction since before the beginning. And I'm always up for it, even though, statistically speaking, on actuarial tables, it usually disappoints. And I've just been spinning the wheel. I'm just going to spin the wheel for the summer of Trek, unless a pattern emerges and takes me captive. And other than that, I'm just going to spin the wheel to determine what I will read next. And I did that last night. I got another Next Generation novel. There were a lot of Next Generation novels. But this one had a resonance with the original series that I wasn't expecting. I largely passed on most of the Next Generation novels. Unless they had crossovers with the original series or seemed to be of some interest, I usually didn't read them because I didn't like the show. I didn't like The Next Generation. It was only really BookTube that taught me how to like the show. That and the third season of Star Trek Picard. But I found, I read a book from The Next Generation. This is by J.M. Dillard and Kathleen O'Malley, and it's called Possession. We have the typical really bad Star Trek tie-in novel cover. They're typically really bad. This one is really bad. The cover doesn't say anything. I mean, granted, this is pastiche fiction, so you know the audience already. You don't have to find an audience. You have one already. But even so, even a Star Trek audience would like a nice cover. And there were at the time when this came out I think in 1990 or something like that, there was no shortage of Star Trek fans who were very talented artists who would have done a cover for free. If the folks at Pocket Books had just cared to go out and look for them, I'm sure that they could have found them relatively easily. Instead, we get this thing. Disembodied heads, something that could be a spaceship at the bottom, but maybe not. Maybe it's a shoehorn. I don't know. But the book I rather liked. It's the story of, on one level, of groundbreaking scientists, including the scientist who actually early in his career created Geordi LaForge's electronic visor that allows his sightless eyes to see. Always a bit of confusion for me. that visor always confused me when I first saw it on Star Trek, and it was revealed that it allows Geordi LaForge to see not only human visible light, but all kinds of other spectrums of light, and even some kinds of electromagnetic radiation that aren't light. I immediately wondered, well, okay, there's no good reason why this has to be just given to blind people. Why wouldn't everyone in Trek, certainly every engineer and science officer, why wouldn't they all have this? And just, why wouldn't it be a skin that you could put over your eyeglasses that would do this? And, of course, it's been dispensed with. The Geordi LaForge in the later movies and in Star Trek Picard doesn't have a visor over his eyes. But that scientist naturally was involved in the transmutation of outside electernal stimuli into the brain, into the human brain. And at the beginning of this book, we learn that his dream is to create an android like Data, so that he doesn't have to worry about a human interface. He can just build that interface from the ground up. And there are others involved as well. There are other scientists involved as well here at the beginning, because the Enterprise, through a series of unlikely events, this book is full of unlikely events, goes to a science fair, kind of science symposium type thing. Worf brings his young son, Alexander, who is not a typical Klingon boy. He's rather well played when he's a teenager. In the later episodes of Star Trek, in like Deep Space Nine, he's rather well done as a dorky teenage Klingon. That's kind of fun. I wish in the show that we'd seen more of that Alexander. But he's a non-conformist Klingon. He's not like Worf. Worf is from a disgraced house in the Klingon Empire and was raised by humans. And because he was raised by a kindly, friendly human couple, he became the Uber Klingon. He insisted on making himself the Uber Klingon. His son isn't like that. And that's a neat clash. He's not old enough for them really to be fighting in this book. He's a boy, and he has all of Worf's affection. And he's fascinated by an exhibit at this science symposium that is run by a woman that quickly starts to spar romantically with Worf, and that element is done well throughout the whole book. The thing that element plays on is the fact that although Worf was raised on Earth, he is not in any part human, and knows all about his people's cultures. So he's a weird character. I don't think any that I know of. I haven't read a whole bunch. I haven't read every Next Generation novel. As far as I know, no writer's ever done him justice on the screen or on the page for what that would make you. It would be very different. It would be a very different thing than, for instance, Mr. Spock, who's half human but is raised on Vulcan and also tries to become an uber Vulcan. Or, for that matter, very different from Deanna Troi, the Enterprises, that the other character on the cover here, Deanna Troi, is also from two different cultures. Almost nothing is made out of that. Maybe Betazoids are just better adapted. But one of the people involved in this science exhibit, in this science, symposium or whatnot, is concerned with something that's at the heart of Star Trek. He's concerned with souls. Actually, the scientist who built Geordi's visor years and years ago is also concerned with that. What he would like is not only to create an android very similar to Data, but to create an android body without Data's mind in it, so that you can transfer a human mind into that android and it can just not worry about death, just live forever. That's a concept that we've seen toyed with a few times on Star Trek. Not only in the episode that introduces the real Christine Chapel, not the "Hey, I know I'm awesome" psycho from Strange New Worlds, but the real Christine Chapel. In that episode, we are introduced to Roger Corby, her beau, who is involved in exactly that kind of research. Can we duplicate a human mind in an indestructible android body? He's using found technology that has already created androids that are 1,000 years old. But it also comes up in another episode of the original series when our crew encounters 3 glowing globules that have the life essence, the soul, the mind, whatever you want to call it, of 3 very powerful ancient aliens. And they can briefly take over human bodies. But in the course of that episode, the 2 good ones, there's one evil one who takes over Spock, but the 2 good ones are contemplating, their plan is, we will use these human bodies that our hosts have very kindly lent us. It's a cooperative thing. We don't have a right to these bodies. We'll use them in order to build permanent, immortal, beautiful android bodies. And we never see those android bodies, but they clearly know how to do it. So the idea of transferring a mind into an indestructible android body is not new to Star Trek. But for some reason, it revolts most of Picard's bridge crew when they hear these stories, especially Picard, who doesn't act in character at any point in this novel. Neither does Beverly Crusher. Picard acts, I don't even know, like your angry grandfather, which I guess if you weren't really in tune with the character, you might think of him that way. I once did, but he's not that. And also, Beverly Crusher, oftentimes in the course of this book, acts like some sort of teenage girl, and so does Guinan, she's off stage most of the action of the book at a conference involving how wonderful chocolate is. Not all the characters, in other words, in this thing are as well served as others, but connected with this science conference are a group of objects that contain intangible alien beings that can possess people, much like those super intelligences in that episode of Star Trek, also like another being in another original episode of Star Trek, Dagger of the Mind, where the crew is having shore leave on the planet Argalius, and Scotty and then a whole bunch of other people are possessed by this intangible being that can take over their bodies, make them talk, make them move around. That being is weakened and jettisoned into space. Not a very conscientious thing for Kirk to do, to get rid of it, to say that it's somebody else's problem. We have no indication in Dagger of the Mind that what the Enterprise does to that being would kill it. So maybe I'm not remembering correctly whether or not J.M. Dillard actually draws a connection between that being and the beings in this book. And the reason why you might wonder why I'm not remembering that correctly is because this isn't the first time J.M. Dillon has written about this. I didn't realize until I was halfway through this book that this is a callback, maybe even a kind of distant sequel, to another Star Trek novel. J.M. Dillard wrote a Star Trek novel called Demons, which is about these same intangible beings, only set 80 years ago. Kirk and his crew have to deal with them instead of Picard and his crew. This makes some references to that book. I confess, it's been a while since I read that book, so I don't know if I caught all the references. And it's kind of odd that I didn't catch anywhere in this book the book itself specifically saying that it was a sequel to that book. Maybe J.M. Dillard and who was it again? Kathleen O'Malley. Maybe they didn't want to draw attention to that, or maybe they were told not to. But it's a fairly pro forma plot. You pretty much know what's going to happen. You know that you pretty much know what's going to happen, and you pretty much know the two crew members on Picard's bridge crew who are going to be instrumental in making it happen. And they do. They do pretty much exactly what you would expect them to do. The book ends on a bit of a tease, but not much of one. And everything is exactly back where it was at the beginning. So it was well written. I actually noticed at times how well written it was, even if the good writing was not in the service of portraying a lot of these characters in character. J.M. Dillard definitely gets Worf. Not even when the characters aren't in character, though. I felt the same way that I did with Planet of Judgment by Joe Haldeman. But even though these characters aren't in character, this is still very enjoyable to read. The Enterprise D crew has to come up with once they learn that possession is afoot, they have to come up with all kinds of ways to combat it, and a lot of those are very predictable. You've seen them on the small screen, you've seen them on the large screen. Still found it enjoyable, but I'm guessing that it was written same kind of, crack the whip short deadline that so many of these things were written for, because it barely examines the core ideas involved, and they are all over Star Trek. The more you think about it, the more you see how widespread they are in Star Trek, how many things are capable of possessing other things. Think, for instance, of that episode, Dagger of the Mind. That being that turns out to be turns out to be Jack the Ripper, when it possesses Scotty and then leaves him, how does it leave him? How is it even in him? And if it's ever in him, to the extent where it can control his neurons in order to move his body around, but also to remember things. Scotty might not remember what his body does when this being is possessing him, but this being remembers what it did when it was possessing him. So it's using his memories. How do you disentangle that? How does the being like that ever leave the person that it possesses, Scotty or anybody else? It's not dealt with in this book. Also, not to go on a Bones McCoy was right all along kick, but what does the transporter do? If you believe that you have an immortal ghost inside your body, you are factually wrong. But plenty of people in the Star Trek universe believe it, just like plenty of people in this world believe it. What do those people do with the transporter? The transporter breaks down your body. It destroys your body and reconstitutes it from an energy matrix. So if you think that way about a soul or a spirit, are you saying that your spirit is in the transporter buffer? Can someone muck around with it? The whole idea of souls is that only gods and devils can muck around with it. Humans can't. That also is never dealt with here at all. And there's one other thing that comes up all over this book. Vulcans are all over this book. At the beginning, there's a main character that runs throughout. There's a very interesting secondary character that runs throughout. And if you think about it, you will immediately see why Vulcans are all over a book like this. Because Vulcans have immortal souls. In the Star Trek universe, Vulcans have immortal souls. They have their katra, which is introduced in the movies. Their summon essence, everything they were, everything they knew, can be transferred into, I guess there's a giant repository of katras on Vulcan. Usually that's how it happens. The dying Vulcan transfers their katra into a receptacle so that it can be telepathically consulted by other Vulcans who can bring it up to speed. They can tell it things. In this book, we're told that the katra of a departed old Vulcan woman is regularly updated on the doings of her children and grandchildren. So there's no real reason to mourn for her. She's not really dead. Her body's not around. The whole thing that happens in Star Trek 3, the Fal Torpan, the ceremony of re-infusion, is very rare. As the Vulcan priestess who says, when she's doing it, she says, what you ask hasn't been done since in ages past, and then only in legend, because you can see it would be the circumstances would be really rare. You would have to have the right body. and most people die. Their body dies, so their katra might go on, but you don't have a living, vital body to put it back into. But could you put it in somebody else's body? Could you put a Vulcan katra in somebody else's body? And what would happen if you did? What is a katra? and what is that, for instance, in Star Trek 3, what is that Vulcan priestess doing when she transfers it from McCoy to Spock? How does she know where the katra inside of McCoy stops and McCoy starts? Spock and McCoy both know English. They've had 50 years of shared experiences in the time when that foul torpan happens. How does she know what to transfer and what not? It opens a whole can of worms that I really wish Star Trek hadn't opened. I really wish that weren't true. And of course, that comes into play in this book, but it's barely dealt with. It's barely discussed. Whether or not, beings possessing other beings in Star Trek is common. Spock can even do it, right? There's an episode where he is across the room from a woman and he wants her to touch his communicator. He can't do it. He's being watched. He's being guarded, and he makes her do it with his mind. What is that if not possession? And so on and so forth. So I kind of wish the book, with that as its title, would have dug in a little deeper on the subject. It doesn't do that. It doesn't do that at all. I enjoyed it for what it was, but if there's a big Star Trek book that thoroughly examines what it means for a katra to exist, then I've never seen it. What happens to Mr. Spock's katra? The second time, not the first time. We know that in Star Trek, in canon continuity, in the Roddenberry era continuity, Mr. Spock is dead. He goes to the alternate Abrams universe and lives out his days there and then dies. Did he know that he was going to die? And if he did he put his katra in some receptacle? Vulcan is destroyed in the Abrams universe. Did any katra survive? And if they didn't, do Vulcans have the ability to make new receptacles so that Spock could do that? Can he transfer his katra to another Vulcan who can hold on to it until they make a receptacle? We don't know. We're never told. We don't know anything about the last days of my Mr. Spock. But it'd be nice. It'd be nice if somebody would examine that. This doesn't really do that. This is really just is this person standing in front of me in the transporter room, who they are? Can I ask them questions? Can I figure out what they are? That sort of thing. Good in its own way, but it left me with more questions than answers. So anyway, that's my Trek book for today. That plus tons and tons of background noise. But I've learned that a lot of the background noise doesn't filter through as much as I think it does. It's not as bad for you as it is for me. So I'm just going to do what I did before. I'm just going to spin the wheel tonight and see what I get for a Star Trek novel. Maybe in the dog days of summer, late July and early August, maybe when that comes around, I will do an informal plan of reading my favorite Star Trek books, going back to my favorite Star Trek books. There are plenty of them. And, of course, there's another plan that suggests itself, right, which is August is Garb August, and quite a few Star Trek novels fit that bill. Maybe I'll torture myself in the month of August for that. But for now, it's totally random. So we'll see what Star Trek book we pick up next time, and I'll be back to talk about it. Thank you.